in the pursuit of truth and common sense in an unbelievable world. You're listening to the Right Mind podcast with your host, Todd Schowalter.
And welcome to Right Mind. My guest today has been with us before, and I'm happy to have him again. He's political analyst Rich Rubino, and he has a new book out. It's called The Great American Political Trivia Challenge, and it's available now for sale. How you doing, Rich?
I'm doing well.
Well, tell us a little bit about the book. You know, I went through it, and you've got a lot of great content, a lot of great questions. What inspired this book? Because you've got, it says here, like over 2,000 questions. How did you compile these, and what inspired you to do this?
Yeah, well, so I wrote a book about 10 years ago, and that was my first book, and it was called The Political Bible of Little Known Facts in American Politics. I've always had this kind of almost congenital interest in the minutia of American politics.
Okay.
So I wrote that book. I was actually looking for something that was based on political facts as opposed to just presidential facts. I found a bunch of presidents' books that I had read before, but the ones that I found were basically only about presidents. So that kind of gave me the idea, put the ideation in my head to write that one. So I wrote that one. Then I wrote a couple others, one about political quotes in American history, and then another one called American Politics on the Rocks, which was kind of political stories. But it gave me the idea, because people would ask me, they'd say, you know, I really like some of these questions. You should make it into a political trivia book. So I thought that's a good idea. So I figured maybe I should make some sort of a book that's not just presidential trivia, because there's a litany of them out there, but one that's political trivia, everything from the House, the Senate, judiciary, states, political insults, political quotations, pretty much everything that I've thought about for my congenital interest in American politics. And after 2.5 years and 500 pages later, I've accumulated, and I also tried to make it as interesting as possible. So it's not just a question and answer. Whenever possible, whenever applicable, rather, I try to deliver some sort of a story that will go there, so it can be most educative and as well as something that you can learn from, but also something that you can find interesting and sometimes humorous, I think, as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it's a lot of fun. I mean, well, at least I do. I like trivia games and things like that. This would make a great game. I mean, you answered my question. You said 2.5 years. I mean, it takes a heck of a long time to come up with over 2,000 questions. So for the past 2.5 years, now, have you just been holed up in your bunker, like researching all this stuff, or it's a heck of a lot of questions? I mean, were most of these taken from things that you've already read, then you said?
Yeah, a lot of it's been somewhere. I made a mental note of stuff as I found it over the years, just stuff that kind of interested me. So then when I was writing this, it was a matter of going back sometimes to the primary sources of when something actually happened. And then when you find something that happened, there's 7, you go down a rabbit hole and you find 7 other things. For example, you go back for the 92, here's a great example. I'll go back for the 1992 Democratic presidential primaries. And I remember Paul Tsongas getting up there, and I remember seeing this on C-SPAN. And he was saying that Bill Clinton was a panda. He was trying to say that he was a panda bear. So he had a panda bear, and this was a prop. And the problem was, because of his accent, it sounded like he was saying panda bear. So the next day, the headline was, why was Paul Tsongas calling Bill Clinton a panda bear when he was trying to say a panda bear? So I looked that up, and then I saw all the references to it. But then I find other references to that election that I find interesting. Like, for example, there was an advertisement that year where Paul Tsongas was swimming to show that he had show his political finesse and that he was in shape. Right. And Richards, the governor of Texas, who Bill Clinton, Jerry Brown, and Paul Tsongas were all trying to garner the endorsement of, comes out and says, I'm less likely to endorse Paul Tsongas because I will never endorse someone for president who looks better in a bathing suit than I do. So I looked that up, and I said, oh, that's great. And then they get other stuff like that. And it just keeps going and going and going. It's just a snowball effect.
Which is why you and I aren't running for president, because we look so good in bathing suits, right?
That's the only thing that matters when you really come down to it. Is yes.
I wouldn't be surprised. Well, tell me this. I mean, out of all these questions, I mean, there's got to be something just really bizarre, something that really threw you a curve. What's the craziest thing you came across?
Oh, there's a bunch of them. I guess one of them would be that. So Lyndon Johnson, of course, was known for an ego. So at one point he went to New York, and the Pope came to the United States. So the Pope Paul V gave Johnson a great picture of the nativity scene. Mm-hmm. So President Johnson, in return, gave the Pope a 5-inch bust of himself as a gift.
Nice.
I thought that was fascinating. The Pope didn't know quite what to do with it, but he actually did this. He had about 200 statuettes made, and when visiting heads of state would come and they'd give him a gift, he'd oftentimes would in return give him a bust of himself, which I thought was absolutely fascinating.
Well, and once again, I mean, the holidays are right around the corner. What a better gift, not a better gift than to give yourself not only a bust, and let's do it in a bathing suit, by the way, a bust in a bathing suit to make it all the better. Well,
I was actually thinking about the best thing to when you want to get gifts for someone, just go those people that put stuff out in front of their house that it says free. Take all that.
Oh, well, I don't know. Now, where do we get this? I mean, is it on Amazon or?
Yep, Amazon. Just type in Amazon and just type in Rich and then the last name Rubino, Rubino, and you can definitely find it there.
That's great. I mean, my gosh, like I said, it's not just a book. I mean, it's a whole tome of information here. The Great American Political Trivia Challenge by Rich Rubino. And there's 2,175 questions and answers, which is good because, I need the answers. Probably 2,174 of these. So way to go on that. Way to go. Well, let's segue a little bit.
Okay.
You're my go-to political guy here on Right Mind. We've got a lot of stuff going on lately. The big thing that I think is kind of interesting that I like to hear where you think it's going, the Virginia election that we just had for governor. I mean, some say that was a huge surprise. I mean, it's definitely, a close race, but, the GOP pulled out on that one. And now they say that may be the catalyst for a lot of things to come. What's your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, historically, generally the party, generally what Virginia and New Jersey races are they're seen as somewhat precursors for the midterm elections. In other words, Democrats that are looking potentially whether they're going to retire, whether in marginal districts, are they going to run potential recruits with, if the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee is trying to recruit someone to run in 2022 in a marginal district, they're going to look at this and potentially going to say, Terry McAuliffe had problems. Potentially I could have problems, so maybe I'll retire or maybe I will not run for re-election. So that's kind of where that's why Virginia is kind of so important. It's not the Virginia race in and of itself, but it also does a couple of things. First of all, what I think this displayed was that you can run essentially in a state where Donald Trump lost by 10.1 points, and you can distance yourself from Donald Trump enough while still garnering his base of voters by not alienating them. So that's kind of the delicate balance. And it's interesting if you look at it. I mean, Massachusetts, Vermont, and Maryland, three of the bluest states in the country, all have very popular Republican governors. And why do they have them? Because they're able to distance themselves from the national party, which is unpopular in their states. And in Virginia's case, the governor-elect now, he did not necessarily alienate himself from Trump per se, but what he would do is as soon as he was asked about Donald Trump, he would immediately segue again, and he would segue into talking about his message and how this is a state race. Now, that being said, it's different in terms of congressional races, because when you're running for governor, the reason that Democrats can get elected governor in Wyoming and Arkansas is because all they have to do is run as a check on the other party. When you're actually running for the House or the Senate, you immediately, the first vote you're going to have is going to be on leadership. So you're going to have to vote for a Speaker of the House. You're going to have, or in the House and the Senate, you're going to have to vote for the Senate Majority Leader. And that's usually somebody often that could be unpopular in your state or district. And it's very hard for you to go for that candidate to go around their state or their district where the person may be unpopular and get that question, just invariably get that question. But that being said, midterm elections in general, the party in power loses in the party that won the White House almost invariably will lose in the first midterm elections. In fact, with the exception to 2002, George W. Bush was popular after Afghanistan and after 9/11. So that year, the Republicans picked up seats. That was the first time that had happened since 1934 with Franklin Roosevelt. In the House of Representatives, Ronald Reagan lost 26 seats in 1982, and Bill Clinton in 1994 lost 53 seats. So I think a lot of Democrats potentially, if historical trends continue, if as Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme, they may be looking at this and they're saying, you know what, I may not want to go through this race. And not only that, but also if Democrats think they're going to be in a minority, they realize that means they're not going to have chairmanships. They're not going to have subcommittee chairmanships. So their power will be very limited as Republicans will take over the House, which is another reason why some Democrats might say, you know what, I'm just going to call it quits and, look for something else to do.
Just run away. Just run away. That's right. Well, which, wouldn't be a bad thing in my opinion for some people. Why? Now you say this is historically this historically happens. Why? I mean, what is the reason for that? Is it just because we brought in a certain party, so to speak, and we don't think they're doing well? Like, well, this is really not going well. I mean, if it's historic, I mean, what typically causes that? Just that the current party in charge is just blowing it, not doing a good job?
Well, I think usually there's a couple of things. First of all, there's always buyer's remorse because in the first 2 years of a new presidency, a lot of people who voted for that person are not getting exactly what they expected. So they potentially could turn to somebody else. Also, you have people in the opposite party who invariably will, have a lot of animosity. And that person has won, so they're more likely to come out in those midterm elections. They're more likely to come out in those midterm elections and vote against that president. But also, you have the issue of overplaying their mandate. Oftentimes, somebody will run for president, and people will think, especially suburban swing voters, will think that they're basically going to have moderate policies and not going to do something dramatic. So Ronald Reagan gets elected in 1980. Then he passes a tax cut in 1981. So, the country was in a recession in 1982. So some moderate voters said, this isn't what we voted for. So they voted for Democrats in Congress. Then by 1984, as the economy recovered, Reagan ended up winning in a landslide. Bill Clinton, 1992, comes in. He raises taxes in 1993. In 1994, there was a movement against that. Newt Gingrich comes up with his Contract of America. Republicans win the House. But then 1996, Bill Clinton gets reelected. Same story. Barack Obama, 2008. Then he passes the Affordable Care Act. There was a backlash against it. Conservatives come out in droves. In 2010, he loses the House, loses the Senate. Then he comes back and he wins the presidency in 2012. In this case, when Joe Biden was running, he was not certainly running as a radical figure. He was not running as, the reincarnation of Franklin Roosevelt with his New Deal, or Lyndon Johnson with the Great Society. I think Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were seen as kind of those who wanted dramatic change. Joe Biden was seen as somebody who was going to be more of a transitional figure than a kind of a transmogrificational figure. So I think there are some suburban voters who are now saying potentially with his infrastructure plan, this is too much. So we're going to vote for somebody else in 2022. Yeah. So that's part of it, I think.
Yeah, and that seems to be the case. I mean, it seems also, how potentially, what kind of turnover do you think we have in 2022? I mean, another host friend of mine, he says we could have up to 100 seats turnover. Now it seems awfully high.
Yeah.
I mean, overall, if you had to predict, how many seats do you think are going to turn?
I think the record was Grover Cleveland, who was very unpopular in 1894. No, I don't think so, because you got to remember, first of all, that a lot of Democrats who lost the last time around were people who had been elected in Donald Trump's first midterm election in 2018. So those were people who were elected as kind of an antidote to Donald Trump. But then all things being equal, in 2020, when essentially a lot of those freshman members lost, so there are just very few marginal districts left, quite frankly. You look at the ones who lost in 2018, 2020, almost all of them were freshmen from marginal districts. You have very, very few Democrats who represent districts that are either close or districts that Donald Trump won. So it's just a mathematical problem. I would say right now, all things being equal, I would say the Democrats will lose 23 seats right now.
23. Okay, so that's about a quarter.
Yeah, I can't see 100 would be if the way something like that would happen. So Franklin Roosevelt, 1934, 1936, the Democrats keep picking up. And then by 1938, there was a complete backlash. Franklin Roosevelt tried to pack the court. And that year, they lost in record numbers, Grover Cleveland as well in 1894, but it's very rare for that big of a change in seats.
Well, one of the things we have going now, and I'd like to get to your take on it as well, is that it seems that, especially in the last presidential election, the Democrats tended to, it wasn't a matter of really so much liking their candidate, they just didn't like the Republican candidate. So, I mean, in that, that's kind of like, picking your two vegetables, which one do you like worse? Now that's not we don't have that right now. How do you think, when you have, say, maybe more balanced candidates, that's going to play out? And what do you think, not only the Democrats, but what do you think the Republicans need to bring to the table to respectively win on their side?
Well, and it's interesting. I mean, Joe Biden was certainly not the favorite candidate of the Democratic base. The Democratic establishment, I think a lot of people nominated him or voted for him simply because they thought that he would be the best candidate in a general election. It was strategic voting. That's why people always say, why were his rallies, why did so few people attend his rallies? Because he wasn't the enthusiasm candidate. Bernie Sanders that year was the enthusiasm candidate. He's the candidate that people would, walk into a wall for. Joe Biden was a candidate who they thought could potentially do well, specifically with blue collar voters in places like Scranton, Pennsylvania, where he was born, in Ohio and Michigan. So it's all about strategic voting. Now, in terms of the Republicans, a lot of people they say political parties need to have cohesive messages, need to have something that's a unifying message. I don't agree. I think in order to win, you have to have a message that strikes a resonant chord in your state or in your district. And obviously, if you're running as a Democrat, for example, in northern Minnesota, your message is probably going to be a lot more conservative than if you're running against Nancy Pelosi in San Francisco. As opposed to having the exact same message everywhere. Politics is all relative. I mean, in San Francisco, for example, there's a lot of people on the left that always want to get primary opponents for Nancy Pelosi because they think she's too conservative. So everything is relative in that respect. But go back to, I think for the Republicans, probably the textbook case for them to look at is 2006. In 2006, for the Democrats, Rahm Emanuel was chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, and he did not look at ideology in terms of the candidates he recruited. He recruited candidates who were against abortion rights, candidates who were against affirmative action, candidates who supported gun rights, who were against gay marriage. And where did he recruit them? Places like North Carolina, where Democrats have no business winning. And Keith Schuler, for example, won a seat that year. You have places with people like Jim Marshall in Georgia. Basically, they were running conservative districts as conservative. You run as conservatives and you serve kind of center right in center right districts and states, moderates somewhere in the middle, and left somewhere, and left obviously in more liberal districts. I mean, in order to get the majority, you have to essentially accrue candidates who are going to specifically speak to that constituency, and if possible, and if applicable, be able to distance themselves from the national party.
Right. And in the past, it's always been, a three-party system. I mean, when you have independents come in, or the libertarians and things, they're usually looked at as splitting the vote, not really taken seriously, things like that. But if you look at, the situation that we have now, even in the Democratic Party, and to some extent, maybe the Republican Party, but we have moderates, and we have, then we have progressives that are extreme left. And then we have some that, it just seems to be, it almost like, and then you have the moderates, but then you have a step below the moderates. So it almost seems like we have a three-party system already in place, even if we're not calling it that. Do you think it's feasible that, given the state of affairs that we have right now, especially with the ultra left-wing progressives that we're looking at, do you think it's feasible that we may eventually in the near future have three parties that could viably compete against one another without splitting the vote?
I don't think so. The American system is so stacked against a third party. And I think the people in the political process know that. They basically, you have to really jump through hoops, whether it's just getting ballot access. And then as soon as the third party gets in, the party that's going to be hurt most immediately says you're wasting your vote. Now, one of the antidote to that is having some sort of a ranked choice voting where you can vote for your third party candidate first. For example, if you vote for Ralph Nader first, Al Gore second, and Ralph Nader doesn't get enough votes, doesn't get the 15%, for example, then your vote goes to Al Gore. So that's one thing to kind of annihilate the wasted voter syndrome, if you will. But usually in the American political system, it's just there have been so many parties that have tried, the progressive parties with Theodore Roosevelt and Robert La Follette. Usually what happens is there'll be one major candidate, somebody that everybody knows, like Theodore Roosevelt running in 1912, then that candidate essentially leaves, and then the party just kind of dissipates. I mean, Ross Perot ran in 1992 as an independent, came back in 96 as a Reform Party nominee. Then after Ross Perot left the scene, the party dissipated to the point where in 2000, Pat Buchanan won the nomination and garners less than 1%. By now, it's essentially just a small designation, just so hard. So essentially what you usually have is you have people who would be third-party candidates trying to run within one of the two major parties. And in this country, we have parties that are kind of catch-all parties, if you will. in most parliamentary systems, every political party, you can get a political party and they can essentially be a force in the parliament by simply just getting, 20 people who are very ideological, who support a very specific point of view. In this country, you have, obviously, in the Democratic Party, you have everyone from Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema on one side, and then you have, AOC and you have the squad on the other side. You say, how are these people in one party? And the reason they're in one party is because because a third party is just so hard. But even if you go back, by the way, to the 1960s, for example, and here's something very interesting. When the Civil Rights Act was passed, the Democratic Party, rather, here's to show the fault lines. In the Southern Democrats, and Democrats controlled the South, with one exception, Ralph Yarborough of Texas voted against the Civil Rights Act. On contrawise, in the North, every single Democrat of West Virginia voted for the Civil Rights Act. So there was such a division in the party. You wonder how can a party with Southern conservatives and Northern liberals, maintain itself? On the other side, you have Barry Goldwater in Arizona, and then you have Ed Brooke in Massachusetts, Jim Javits in New York, people who would be Democrats today. So it's very hard. You do have a catch-all party system, and it's very hard for a third party to have sustainability in this system, unlike in parliamentary systems.
Well, and then also, of course, it comes down to the Electoral College and who has the most electoral votes. And of course, you have a lot of, sour grapes. It seems like, well, we lost. We should get rid of the Electoral College and blah blah blah. Which it sounds like poor loser syndrome. But you have, I mean. Do you think that's even feasible, that someday we would get rid of the Electoral College and just have a winner take all by especially now with the voting discrepancies that we have? I mean, do you think that's even on the horizon?
I don't think you're
losing it.
There's not going to be a constitutional amendment, but there is a movement going through the states right now. Professor John Cause, it's called the National Popular Vote Movement. And a lot of states have actually already signed on to it. So basically, the Constitution says each state shall appoint in such a manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. It does not say how the electors are supposed to be awarded. You go back to 1789, the first election, only 3 states actually awarded their electoral votes to whoever wins this popular vote. So what is this Interstate Compact? The Interstate Compact, basically every state that's in this compact will say that they will award their electoral votes to whoever wins the popular vote. So for example, a state like if California is in this compact and a Republican wins, California will award all their electoral votes to that Republican, for example, because Jerry Brown, the legislature, had signed off on that. So that is something that I do think is very feasible for it to happen that way. And by the way, each state is only going to do this when it adds up to the requisite 270 electoral votes. So in other words, no one state is going to necessarily unilaterally disarm. Illinois is not going to say, you know what, we're going to award our electoral votes to whoever wins the national popular vote, but no other state's going to do it. It all has to kick in kind of at that time. And it's a way, as I say, you go back to the Constitution, and there's nothing in it saying that the states have to award their electoral votes to whoever wins the popular vote. We have a system now where essentially, I think medium states like Ohio and Florida can't spend an inordinate amount of time there, whereas states like California and New York are used as ATMs, and states like North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana are completely ignored. So I do see that scenario, but not in terms of a constitutional amendment.
Okay, well, the bottom line comes down to, even if it is electoral, I mean, obviously, unless there's a big, mutiny, so to speak, I mean, the popular vote is going to get the electoral vote as well. If I am, regardless if I'm a Republican or a Democrat, we have such a divided nation right now. I go back thinking when Reagan came in back in '80 with coming on the heels of Jimmy Carter, we needed somebody to unify the country. It seems like at this point, we need the country to unify. Now, if I am a candidate, regardless, I could be Republican or Democrat, what do you think a candidate is going to have to do to appeal not to just his base, but also across the board to everybody else? You think that's even possible in this day and age?
It's hard because, well, in order to do it, I think you have to be somebody that's running in a moderate. You have to be running in either a moderate state or a moderate district, a purple state, if you will. If you're running in Ohio statewide, if you're running in Florida statewide, and essentially, if you're a Democrat or a Republican, in order to win, you have to be able to reach over. You have to be able to have some crossover support. And in order to do that, you can't necessarily have an ideological message. That being said, if you're running in some of the more Democrat, if you're running in Berkeley, California, for example, and you're running as somebody saying, I want to reunite Republicans and Democrats, you're probably not going to win. or vice versa. If you're running in Midland, Texas, and you say, you know, I want to bring Democrats and Republicans together, you're not going to win because those are very ideological districts. But also, you got to remember, there's never, in terms of people that want to unify, you know, there's never riots in terms of wanting to storm the Bastille. I never seen a moderate riot. But the people on the far left and the far right are usually the ones that are more galvanized and they're more part of the political system. The low propensity voters, people who can go either way, crossover voters, are people usually, and this is obviously an overgeneralization, but they're usually people who have a peripheral interest in politics, and they're not going to spend their time trying to unite people. The people that are on the far right, just go look at your social media feed. The people on the far right and the far left are usually the ones that speak that speak more vociferous, but also they're the ones that usually feel passionately about it. So sometimes they can have kind of an outsized proportion. But that being said, usually there is kind of a self-correcting mechanism. I mean, certainly the country was very divided in the 1960s, for example, over the Vietnam War. But then after the Vietnam War under Ford, and certainly under Ford and Carter in 1976, I think you saw two basically moderate candidates, center right and center left, kind of running against each other. And I think there was kind of a self-correcting mechanism. I don't think we're going to be divisive for, you know, the next 20 years or so, but obviously we're in a time right now where we are extremely divisive. But also remember this, that there are a lot of people who are just depoliticized completely, and you can basically live a life in the United States and have very little interest in politics and still basically get along with your day. And that's a lot of people. And if you just talk about stuff, generally speaking, we talk about things other than politics, or you talk about political trivia or things that are fun with people that you disagree with, you can have a pretty good dialogue sometimes.
Well, that's what it should be. And I think, you know, again, I think everybody should get along. I mean, in a utopia world, which certainly isn't.
Thomas More.
But maybe, you know what, maybe your book, Rich, maybe your book will bring everybody together and realize we all do have a common interest in politics, and we can all come together over at a party over your book, The Great American Political Trivia Challenge, and all become a happy big family. What do you think? No?
Yes, absolutely. There used to be a time when there were, you know, by the way, Hubert Humphrey and Barry Goldwater, two people on the complete opposite sides of the political spectrum. Hubert Humphrey would make fun of Barry Goldwater in his speeches. Barry Goldwater would make fun of Hubert Humphrey, but then they actually hung out together afterward. I don't think we have a, here's something I find fascinating. Back in the day, Joe Martin and Sam Rayburn from Texas, Joe Martin from Massachusetts, and they would intersperse between becoming speaker and minority leader. And there was one time when someone said they wanted Sam Rayburn to go to Massachusetts to campaign against Joe Martin. And Sam Rayburn says, campaign against Joe, heck, if I lived there, I'd vote for him. Now I wonder, imagine if someone went to Kevin McCarthy, went to Nancy Pelosi and said, you know what, Kevin McCarthy has some trouble up in Bakersfield. I want you to campaign against Kevin McCarthy. And Nancy Pelosi says, you know what, if I lived up there, I'd vote for him. I just don't see that happening.
No, it just doesn't seem like, you know, you're either on this team or that team. It doesn't seem like there's much love in between, but, you know, maybe your book can change that. Who knows? You know, like I said, it's worth a shot. But we're just about out of time. It's always a pleasure to have you on, Rich, because you are the Right Mind political correspondent. I always appreciate that. And once again, your book, well, it's on the screen, The Great American Political Trivia Challenge. It's available on Amazon. It makes a great holiday gift. And the great thing about your book, Rich, I don't think it's stuck on a barge out in the middle of the ocean somewhere, is it? I think you can get these pretty quick, can't you?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And there you go. All the better. Okay. My wife, we ordered this has nothing to do with your book. We got a refrigerator that we bought back in June, just showed up. That will not be the problem of your book. But anyway.
Wow. Anyway. And if you don't like it, you can just simply use it as a stepladder. So.
Well, no, you know, I think everybody will like it. You know, I do. I mean, I love trivia, and you've got some stuff in here that I'm like, wow. I mean, I never realized. I never realized that Grover Cleveland was married to Jimmy Carter. I mean, I'm kidding. No, I'm joking. Rich, it's been a pleasure. I'd love to have you back soon because we got a weird political climate out there. I want to thank you for joining me. And like I said, hope to see you soon. Thank you very much.
And I will correct you. Grover Cleveland was actually married to Benjamin Harrison.
Knew it. See, and that's just it. That's why we need the book. That is why we need the book. And that's why I never win in any trivia games. I stick to bingo. I'm not even invited to those trivia events anymore. So anyway, but maybe that'll change if I read your book some more. Thank you so much, Rich. It's been a pleasure as always, and you take care. And again, the book, one more time, is The Great American Political Trivia Challenge, available on Amazon. The link is on the screen. I want to thank everybody for joining me today on Right Mind. I'm Todd Schowalter. And remember, if you don't have a right mind, you don't have a mind at all. Till next time, bye-bye.
This has been the Right Mind Podcast with Todd Schowalter.